using it like once in 6 months or twice in 6 months. So they wanted to increase that. So then we asked them, okay, how is there a goal? So then they say that, we want customers to use it at least 4 times a month. So that was a very specific target that they gave us. And then in addition to that, we also spent more than a month learning about their internal data sources. Because what happens is, like, generally we have this tendency to basically want, okay, I have this data, I want external data, I want social media data, and so on. So what we found is the internal data that you have already is so rich. It's just a matter of figuring out the context of that data. So, and that context is stored with the business teams, right? They know what this data means, right? And so you need to work very closely with them to figure out what the context is. So you can spend a lot of time reading about deep learning and algos and all of that. But in addition to that, also spend time with your business guys to basically understand what the data is, right? And in what context it's being captured, to basically really come up with a solution which will actually give the results that you're looking for. So we worked really closely with them, and we spent a whole month just understanding what data they have, right? It's like a bank, so they have more than 300 data sets. So, and we ended up using only 2 of them, right? But we needed to understand what the context was and how the data was being generated. So that really helps focusing on the brief. Then coming to implementing habitual AI for the bank, one of the first things that we did was we spent a lot of time figuring out how the output should look like, right? Because a lot of time what happens is AI is an extremely, you can have lots of different outputs can come out from the AI, right? So how do you figure out what recommendations to give to the customers, right? So there again, we work with the business team to figure out that, each use case of banking can be a recommendation, right? Something as specific as, like for example, debit card, you want to change your debit card PIN. So that is a very specific feature of banking. So that's a very specific feature of banking, right? And so, like that, we worked with them to figure out, using the data, what are the other features of banking that are being captured, because not all features get captured. So we worked out what features are getting captured, and then we worked with the business teams to figure out what their objectives were for that quarter, like, which features they wanted to promote and which features they didn't care about. So again, this was like a collaborative process where we convinced them to even market some of the non-financial features where the bank doesn't explicitly make money from it, right? So we were able to convince them to do that. For example, checking your balance. That was one marquee feature which the bank doesn't make any money, but we still convince them that it's an important feature because it builds habits, right? So it's that kind of collaboration is really important to basically with the business teams to figure out exactly what their objectives are. And of course, like, you as a data scientist, you can give them insights and you can give them new perspectives which will convince them, right? In this case, how we convince them of promoting a non-financial feature. And the other thing that we also focused on is basically customer success, right? And so what I mean by that is, it's not enough to just give the recommendation or to just give the result and go away. You need to make sure that they're able to use the result effectively, and they understand what that result means. So we had to do a number of workshops with their marketing team, with their product team, so they understand what these results mean. Because especially when you are working with a very large organization and you're working on large data sets, there is a lot of discrepancy in terms of what the metrics are. So for example, how do you calculate churn? Like, it might seem okay, this is how you calculate churn, but there could be so many definitions of churn. Is it like, is he coming back on the platform? Is that or it doesn't come back in the next month, is that churn? Or it doesn't come back for 2 consecutive months, is that churn? What is churn? So a simple question like what is churn itself, it takes a lot of working together to come to a conclusion that, okay, this is churn and this is a reasonable definition. And that helps even post facto, right? Once you come up with the recommendations, and how do you measure the impact of your product, right? How do you measure the impact of your recommendations? So it's really important for us to be able to work with the business teams and figure out exactly how these recommendations will be used. So we had to actually create custom guidebooks for their marketing team, which will help them use the recommendations, because they were more used to sending out campaigns to like a large number of people with minimal segmentation and minimal personalization. But now we were saying that for this customer, just send one recommendation. That's it. And you talk only about one feature, but you cannot keep repeating the same thing, right? So we had to create drip campaigns talking about one feature, right? So for example, if you take fund transfer, how do you do fund transfer? How do you do multiple touches for fund transfer? So we worked with their marketing teams to extract their domain knowledge and basically imbibe into our recommendations. So that is, and so that kind of follow through basically helps. You just don't give the recommendations and leave. You also stay back and see how the recommendations get implemented and how the personalization is actually being used by the teams. So just briefly in terms of the result, because we worked with them so closely, and their team supported us throughout the entire process. So there was a 145% increase in digital banking transactions. They've been using it for a year, and consistently they're seeing these results month over month. And there was an increase in net revenue. The number of features that the customers started using, right, that increased as well. And we attribute this success to habitual AI, but also to the client and the client's teams, because they really helped us understand the problem and basically figure out, even though we have our solution pre-built, we customized our solution towards their problem, their specific objectives. That is really key. So you can have the best algos, but if the recommendations don't get used, then it's going to be, if they don't get used correctly, it's not going to have the impact that we're looking for. Sure. Yes, it is. So it was for the customers who used our recommendation. So it's only specifically for those customers who use our recommendations versus customers who didn't. So for customers who didn't, it was just a normal growth. You'll have to speak up. I can't hear you. If you can. So for that, we actually used 24 months of transaction data to basically train our models. So we learn habits over time. It's not like we don't learn habits in a month or 2 months data. So we looked at around 5 million customer data for 24 months. So it's like huge amounts of data that we processed to basically come up with the right recommendations. So see, the thing is, for this one, they were actually, we didn't have any off-the-shelf models that we use. So it's like a multi-stage system wherein we start out by creating a classifier. Right, for the classifier, we use random forest and an ensemble with gradient boosted trees. But after that, we had to come up with a new set of algorithms to basically to give specific recommendations there. Right, so that's a patent pending algorithm that we developed, which does two things. One, it is able to come up with these specific recommendations, and at the same time, it's able to process large amounts of customer data at scale. So to give you an instance, we are able to do around 1 million customers we can process on a single 32 GB node. So we Yeah, sure. So we tried some deep learning techniques. However, they were not just the data prep took more than 52 hours. Just the data prep. I'm not even talking about actually running the recommendation algo. So from that perspective, like we had to like really struggle for quite some time before we came up with this solution. So I've been talking about what we've learned along the way. So I'll make the learnings a bit more specific. So again, like to reiterate my point, make sure that the brief is really crisp and precise, right? You agree on all the definitions up front. What is churn? What is engagement? All these things might sound obvious, but they are not, right? When you start digging in, if you don't have them down, if you don't have them precisely defined by the business teams, no matter what you do, right, they will always come up with a loophole, right? Sure. We are looking at customer engagement data across all channels. So we're looking at clickstream data, we're looking at the transaction data that happens on like branch, ATM, digital, IVR, and so on. So across the board, all the data gets blended and then gets fed into the AI. Sure. Mhm. Right. 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 So see, the thing is, for this one, where we've really solved the problem is basically the solve the problem of building habits. See, habits don't get built in like a day or 2 days or and that journey is what we have learned, right? But out of 100 people, maybe there'll be like 3 or 5% of the population who actually is a habitual or a power user, who are your best customers, right? The idea is how to replicate their success for the rest of the 95%. That is what we have automated. Generally, you can do this using where you're manually analyzing the paths, but when you have 12 million paths, what do? Right? You cannot do it manually. That's where the AI advantage comes into play. This is a problem primed for AI. So we take like basic the demographic data, but that is not core to the model. The core is basically engagement and behavioral data primarily to basically use. And the paths are not explicitly enumerated, because when you have 12 million paths, you cannot just keep searching for the paths. That's not going to work, right? So what we do is actually basically we encode these paths into a model, and that's a proprietary model that we have created, and then we basically create recommendations based on that model. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Do you launch triggers like inactive campaigns or rescue campaigns to bring the customers back to in life?
Right. So see, the thing is, the idea with this system was to basically move away from incentive-based campaigns, right? Wherein earlier the approach was that the bank was taking is, here is 300 rupees, why don't you go and do a fund transfer, or here is a coupon for Provogue, or they were giving incentives to the customer, but they were not focusing on the underlying value of the feature itself. So what we help the bank do is basically figure out specifically why he should be using digital banking in the first place. Because if you can figure out why the customer should use that banking feature, because at the end of the day, you cannot keep giving incentives month over month, right? You can only give incentive once. But if you convince the customer that he should be using mobile banking or he should be using digital banking, and you can convince him of his value from his perspective, specific to him, how it is important, how it is useful for him, then the customer, you don't have to nudge the customer anymore.
So my follow-up question to it is
Right.
that it's a very common practice that if you spend X dollar for a customer, to win back the customer, you always get a delta X in return, right? So
Right.
that's a business model that's already existing. So did your model, outperform the existing one, or it's a different way approach?
Yeah, so it completely outperformed that, because without giving that incentive, we were able to increase engagement. So now, earlier there was a cost, now that cost doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Over here.
So my question is that after you make a particular suggestion or a process improvement to your client, there would be a particular maturity time for the model.
Right.
And any business would like this maturity and the scalability time to be as minimum as possible.
Right.
So how do you handle that?
So for that, actually, what we did was we took a very long history of transaction data, right? So we basically did out-of-time validation. So we had enough time left within. So we took 24 months of transaction data, right? So out of that, we only used 18 months of transaction data to basically build and validate our models. And then we use the rest of the 6 months to basically do out-of-time validation for a model to make sure that when the model goes into production, it's going to be ready and good to go from day one.
Does it mean that actually the scalability and the maturity time was actually zero?
Pretty much, because we started seeing results from the first month onwards.
That's cool.
Thanks.
One question. The back side. Right side. How do you test your model with respect to external factors? For example, in this case, while increasing digital transactions was your problem statement,
Right.
but then there was an external factor like demonetization,
Right.
which would have invariably, increase your model's effectiveness. So that would have worked in your favor. But on contrary, there can be another factor which would kind
So the experience, that's a really interesting question, because we were developing this during that time, and all our models were like, going off the chart. Like, we were like wondering what is going on. That's when we came up with a new way to measure our output, so that like, we rather than just doing like A/B testing or test and control, what we did was like, we took the concept of differentiating between customers who did the recommendation and who didn't do the recommendation, because both of them would have experienced the same environment. Because you're talking about a large enough base, they would have experienced the same environment. So, but the only difference between them is one took the recommendation and one didn't. So the people who took the recommendation, there was a big jump, right? And so we were able to control that way. However, one of our attrition models stopped working because of demonetization, because during that period, all the parameters just went haywire, right? And we had to really change, like overhaul after the fact, right? After a few months after demonetization, just like, everything went crazy. So, there was some firefighting there.
Hi.
Hi.
So we talked about the campaign of getting the customers back to the platform and all. The question is, how do you draw a line and how to make sure that you're not, interfering with the customer's privacy? And do we have enough space to pivot if tomorrow, let's say, a government or analytics says, I mean, they enforce some very strict privacy laws. I mean, you're not allowed to send campaign mails and all that stuff to the customers over a certain frequency. I mean, does our models actually allow us that space, or I mean, if suddenly things change, we will be able to?
Right. So from the inception of Trilok itself, we were very focused on basically making sure that we minimize communication to the customers, right? We even built a no recommendation, wherein the model says don't recommend anything to this customer, and that happens to quite a large number of customers where the customers don't need a recommendation. So that kind of stuff is built in, right? And what we have seen is, if you make sure that the communication is very targeted and precise, and you don't send it out too often, then the communication becomes useful to the customer, because you are actually educating the customers about a specific feature of your product. Because we are all the tech savvy here, but what about the person in rural Bihar? Like he might not know what a fund transfer is, but if you educate him about what a fund transfer is, it can actually change his life. It can add lots of value to his life, because he doesn't have to go to the branch anymore. He doesn't have to walk 20 kilometers to go to the branch. He can just do it from a smartphone, because he has a smartphone now.
Yeah. So I have a question around. Oh, yeah. Hi.
Yeah, hi.
I have a question around the AI-based solution. So the thing that you have demonstrated over here, like part of it is around machine learning.
Right.
Okay. Over and above, on top of it, we have behavioral analytics.
Right.
So when we talk about AI-based, so it's a very broader term. So what essential other key things that you would want to share that stood out? We have a component of machine learning that's
right.
new, but then on top of it, behavioral analytics that has been there.
Right.
So what else stood out?
So the other innovation that we worked on is basically at two levels. The first level is basically going for a long-term objective, right? You're not just trying to figure out the propensity of the customer in the next month, whether he's going to take a loan in the next month or not, right? You are basically looking at a long-term objective of, let's say the next 6 months. What is he still going to be a customer 6 months down the line?
Yeah.
Right.
My question is around what sort of any other AI technique that you used apart from machine learning or your behavioral analytics? So anything else?
Right. So we experimented with LSTMs. We experimented with a lot of deep learning techniques. However, what we found is in real life, they require too much computing power for them to be useful and to be cost effective for a regular business. See, it might make sense for Amazon to spend that kind of money because they already are owning the hardware and software and everything. So from their perspective, it makes sense to basically use these advanced techniques, and even if there is like a 2% delta, it still makes sense for them. But to an average business, that 2% delta might not be enough to spend, let's say, $2 million on just on hardware.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, another question.
So yeah, just to sum it up, basically, like deep learning, it works for the big guys, but I haven't been able to, like, no matter what we did to basically make it cost effective is been it's been a challenge. Yeah.
Another question, that you've been receiving data left, right, center. So I mean,
Right.
so machine learning, it makes sense to run on large data sets because of all the computational power. But for analytics purpose, right? How do you use it? Because see, when we have a lot of data set using or fetching that for analytics purpose, that becomes a little challenge.
Right.
So what sort of approach do you have from an analytics perspective and from a machine learning perspective?
So from an analytics perspective, actually what we have found is there is a lot of hidden information in machine learning models. So for example, I'll give you, if you look at just the feature importance of let's say a random forest based model, that itself will give you so much analysis. Like, there's so much hidden insight in that. If you just look at the feature importances, like, if you're able to map that feature importance to a business objective. So one of the ways we used that was basically we highlighted certain features of digital banking that were actually driving attrition. People were stopping to use after they have used this feature. So that was really interesting to the business team, because they said that, okay, why are out of my 60 features that I have there, people who use these features were being driven to not come back. So that was really interesting. And of course, even the flip side, like certain features are actually driving engagement and they were driving retention. So we were able to highlight those features to the business teams, which they found really useful, which we didn't have to do anything. We just had to give it the model and we had to give it the right engagement data to the machine learning model, and they gave us, this was like a side benefit.
So you were using cloud for your data hosting?
No, everything is on-premise. Everything is on-premise.
So when you say you change the customer behavior, is it by you continuously recommend him something and then steer him through the behavioral changes, or?
Right, so we basically help the customer figure out what is valuable in digital banking.
But by giving him recommendations or popping up something in front of him, because he's not in front of you. So
right, so we basically send out emailers. We had the relationship managers call the people.
All that combined.
Right. So that is decided again by the business team and the marketing team of the bank, how they want to use the recommendations. So we gave them like a set of best practices of how to use our recommendations.
Now you've seen such a big surge, 145% that you were saying. So you fear that it might be, there would be a saturation point. Most of the users are like onboarded on that, using the app.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a continuous journey.
It's a continuous journey, but India has a population of 1.2 billion. Okay. Just one last question, I guess. Yeah.
Check. I understand that this has worked amazingly in a digital platform. Do you think
Right.
that you can scale it to a brick and mortar also?
I think so. Yeah. If you have the use case, we are happy to work with you. We have a stall near here, so you can come by. And
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the great questions.
All right, we'll now quickly have a 5-minute tea coffee break. So please step out, enjoy the coffee tea that's being served, and join us. Be back in 5 minutes, please. Thank you.